The station clerk had already read the note. Ingrid Madsen knew it before she touched the paper. She knew it from the broken seal pressed flat with a dirty thumb. She knew it from the red pencil mark on the store ledger. And she knew it from the way the clerk kept staring at her mouth, waiting for it to tremble. It did not. The note was one line. Henrik had taken the oxen west, sold the harness, and left no address, no money, no promise. No word for the 7-year-old boy standing beside Ingrid in boots full of mud, asking if his father had sent licorice. Outside, a cold rain moved across northern Dakota Territory and turned the road back to her claim into 12 miles of black gumbo. Ingrid folded the note once, then once again, and put it in her coat as if it were not the end of everything. By dusk, everyone at the Knife River crossing knew. By morning, the men at Silas Rook's woodyard knew. By supper, the widows knew. The school children knew. And Ingrid's private ruin had become settlement weather, something people measured, discussed, and expected to worsen. She had $15.60, a half sack of flour, 32 pounds of beans, a strip of salt pork already cut too thin, a boy named Niels whose cough worsened whenever smoke backed out of the stove, and a claim shanty built from boards so narrow and green that winter could see through them. The cabin stood on 160 acres of raw prairie, 6 miles from the nearest timber and 300 yards from a frozen slough full of cattails nobody wanted. It was 11 feet by 13 feet. 1 room, 1 door. No storm porch, no tarred paper. A canvas roof nailed with bent nails Henrik had pulled from a freight crate. The stove was a small sheet iron box with a pipe that rattled in hard wind. There was less than 1/3 of a cord of cottonwood stacked by the east wall. Less than 1/3. Ingrid did not need a man to tell her what that meant. But one came anyway. Mikael Arneson arrived 3 days after the note. He was 64, Norwegian-born, with a beard cut square under his chin and one shoulder that sat lower than the other from 40 years of hauling green logs. He had helped raise half the shanties along the crossing. He had dug graves in the winter of '84. He measured bad shelter the way a doctor measures fever. He walked around Ingrid's cabin without knocking. He put 2 fingers into a crack between the boards and looked through it. Inside, Niels sat on a straw mattress, drawing roads in the dirt floor with a willow stick. Mikkel turned back to Ingrid. "1 board," he said. He tapped the wall with his pipe stem. 1 board between that boy and January. He named every failure because he believed clear numbers were kinder than soft voices. 5 cords of hardwood, minimum, at $2.90 a cord if she hauled it herself, $3.60 if Silas Rook delivered it on credit. Tarred paper, $9. Nails, $1.40. A hired team, another $6 if a team could even cross the mud. Then the stovepipe, then the roof. Then banking soil against the walls before the frost locked the ground hard. Mikkel looked at the small woodpile. "You have enough for 10-mile days," he said. "Not winter. 10 days." Ingrid's shawl was wet at the shoulders. Her hands were folded under it so he could not see them, shaking. "What would you have me do?" "Sell the improvements," Mikkel said. "Take the boy to the rail town, find laundry work, live through winter somewhere with walls." He did not say Henrik was gone for good. He did not need to. Ingrid looked past the cabin, past the hay-colored prairie toward the slough. The cattails stood there in a brown field, stiff and worthless, their heads torn by wind, their stems rattling like bones. Nobody cut them for fuel. Nobody paid for them. Even cattle stepped around the thickest mats. They were the kind of thing men ignored because they could not sell it. "I am not leaving," Ingrid said. Mikkel shut his eyes just once, as if he had heard a door close. "Then I will look for smoke in spring," he said. "And if I do not see it, I will know." He rode away. Ingrid stood in the yard until his horse disappeared into the low gray rain. Then she went inside, sat beside her son, and opened Henrik's note again. One sentence. One man's escape. One winter now aimed directly at her door. That night, the wind came from the northwest. It pushed smoke through the cracked stovepipe and laid a gray band across the ceiling. Niels coughed until his face went red, then blue around the lips. Ingrid held him upright and listened to the boards breathe. The cabin was not losing heat in one place. It was losing it everywhere. Through the board seams, under the door, past the roof edge, through the floor. Mikkel had been right about one thing. She could not heat the shanty enough from inside. Not with her wood, not with her stove, not with money she did not have. So the problem had to change. Not how to make more fire, how to make the cold arrive weaker. In the morning, the rain turned to wet snow, only an inch. By noon, the open ground was bare again, scoured clean by prairie wind. But at the slough, the snow clung. It stayed in the cattail heads. It packed between the willow shoots. It caught in the bent reeds and did not move. Ingrid walked out with Niels, wrapped in a blanket under her shawl. The wind tore at her face in the open yard. But behind the cattails, the air changed. Not warm, still. That was all. Still. And the memory came back so sharply she could smell the salt in it. She was 9 years old on the coast of Jutland. Her father was repairing a reed fence along a dune road where winter wind carried sand hard enough to cut skin. He had pressed her hand behind the fence. "Feel the difference, Ing," he had said. "The reed does not stop the storm. It makes the storm spend itself." Then he had packed snow into the fence by hand and tapped it with his knuckles. When wind slows down, snow begins to build. And when snow builds where you tell it to build, he had smiled, you get a wall for free. Ingrid had not thought of that sentence for 20 years. Now she stood in a Dakota slough with her child coughing into her collar, staring at the only material she had in abundance. Cattails, sloughgrass, willow, snow. The prairie had been trying to kill her with wind. Maybe she could make the wind carry its own defeat. That evening, Ingrid drew the first plan on the inside of an empty flour sack. The cabin perimeter was 48 feet. The north and west sides needed the thickest shield because that was where the killing wind came from. Not a wall touching the house, a second skin. A reed fence built around the cabin with a hand-width channel of still air between the fence and the boards. 8 inches between willow stakes. 2 courses of woven slough grass at the bottom. Cattail bundles higher up. Seed heads facing outward to catch snow. Cross ribs every 16 inches on the windward sides, so drifting snow would lodge high instead of piling at the base. A clear clay collar around the stovepipe. A 3-foot bare earth ring where no grass or reed could reach. A door passage angled away from the northwest, so snow could not drive straight into the cabin. She counted it 3 times. At least 110 stakes. Maybe 4,000 cattail stems. Maybe 6,000 by the time wind and mistake and breakage had taken their share. 6 weeks of work. Maybe 5. If the first ice rain came before the wall was packed, it could flatten the whole thing. If she tied the bundles wrong, the snow would pull them down. If the reeds dried too much before snow locked them in place, Silas Rook would call it a fire trap and be right. If she spent the last fair days cutting slough grass and the plan failed, there would be no second plan. Only the shanty, the stove, the small woodpile, and a winter with nothing between its teeth and her son. The next morning she began. She cut willow until the knife handle blistered her palm. She hauled cattails on a canvas drag made from Henrik's old bed ticking. She drove the first stakes with the back of an axe, each one leaning slightly outward because snow had weight, and weight needed somewhere to go. Niels sorted stems by length, the straight ones for binders, the hollow ones for packing, the broken ones for floor bedding. He asked why they were building another house outside the house. Ingrid looked at the north wind crossing the field. "So winter has to knock twice," she said. The first person to come and laugh was not Silas Rook. It was his hired man, Jonah Pritch, who drove past with a wagon of split oak and slowed down just enough to see. By night, Silas himself came. He was 46, broad through the belly, with a beard too well trimmed for a man who claimed to make his living in wood. He sold fuel to those who could pay. He sold fuel on credit to those who could not. And by March, when the credit turned sour, he bought claims for the price of unpaid winter. Henrik's abandoned homestead interested him. The claim bordered the dry ridge road between the slough and the freight line. Control that strip, and Silas could shorten every wood haul from the North Groves. He had been waiting for Ingrid's fear to ripen. Now he found her in the yard, tying cattail bundles to crooked stakes. "That," Silas said, "is not a wall." Ingrid kept working. "That is bedding for a cow." She pulled a willow strip tight with her teeth. Silas looked at the cabin, then at the reeds, then at Niels, who was stacking stems with the seriousness of a clerk counting coins. "I will forgive Henrik's store account," Silas said. $11.20. I will give you $6 cash besides. You sign over the improvements before first hard freeze. Ingrid did not look up. "No." "You cannot winter a child inside a haystack." She twisted the willow and cinched the bundle against the stake. "A haystack would be warmer than these boards." Silas smiled because he thought she had given him the joke. At the store that evening, he repeated it to anyone who would listen. "Ingrid Madsen is burying her cabin in slough trash," he said. "Come Christmas, the boy can hang stockings on the cattails." Men laughed. Children took it farther. They called it the reed coffin. At the well, one girl asked Niels if his mother was making a house for muskrats. He came home quiet. Ingrid asked what happened. He shook his head. She did not have time to comfort pride. The north wall was still open. By October 18th, Ingrid had driven 39 stakes along the north side. By October 25th, the lower course was woven. By October 28th, the first hard lesson arrived. Wet snow fell through the night, thick and heavy. Ingrid woke before dawn to a sound like a load of laundry sliding off a line. The middle of the north shield had slumped. Not all of it. Enough. 8 feet of cattails lay in the mud, their willow ties loosened, their stems bent, their snow shaken loose. 2 days of work gone. Ingrid knelt in the gray morning and began pulling the bundles apart with numb fingers. That was when a woman's voice came from the track. "You are tying reeds as if they want to stay tied." Ingrid turned. A small woman stood there with a birch cane and a basket on her arm. Her name was Lisa Korpi, Finnish, widowed. Older than she looked and younger than her lungs sounded. She lived in a peat dugout beyond the slough and had survived 11 winters in a room lower than a cellar. She had woven fish weirs on the rainy river before she ever saw Dakota, and she understood flexible wood the way Mikael understood logs. Lisa stepped into the mud and picked up one failed tie. She shook it. The willow strip slid down the stem. "Straight pull slips," she said. "Snow pulls down. Wind pulls sideways. Your knot answers neither." Ingrid wiped mud from her wrists. "I did not ask for charity." Lisa looked at the collapsed reeds. "Good. I brought correction." She took a green willow strip from Ingrid's kettle, bent it warm, looped it around a stake, and twisted it once under the bundle, not over it. Then she tucked the tail back into the braid. "When it dries," Lisa said, "it bites." She made Ingrid do the next one, then the next. Then she showed her how to turn the cattail heads outward, but cross the butt ends in alternating layers, so the wall was not a stack, but a weave, a trap, not a pile. By noon, the failed section stood again. By dusk, it had taken new snow without moving. Lisa did not smile. "Better," she said. Then she pointed to the stove wall. "No reed near that pipe. 16 inches bare. Clay there, tin there, earth below. If you make a warm house and burn it down, winter still wins."
She returned the next day, and the next, not as a servant, not as a savior, as a pair of hands that knew what Ingrid's hands were trying to learn. The work changed after that. Ingrid cut and hauled. Niels sorted and counted. Lisa sat on a stool near the wall, twisting willow binders, correcting the lean, and saying very little unless a mistake deserved words. The north shield went up first, 30 feet long, 2 feet thick. Cattail heads outward. Slough grass packed low, because it traps snow near the ground without rotting as fast as cattail. The west shield followed. Then the entry passage, 3 feet long, bent like an elbow. Then the shorter south and east shields. All of it kept a hand-width away from the cabin boards. "Dead air is a blanket," Lisa said. "Wet wood is a coffin. Do not confuse them." Mikael Arneson returned on November 11th. He dismounted and stood before the north shield for a long time. It no longer looked like loose trash. It looked like a brown, bristling hedge grown around a house. Mikael put his shoulder into it and pushed. The stakes flexed. The reeds compressed. The wall held. He walked the chimney side, checked the clay collar, the bare earth ring, the scraped gap under the lowest course. "Who taught you the binders?" he asked. "Lisa Korpi." Mikkel nodded once. "She made eel traps for men who thought fish were stupid. Fish were not stupid. The men were." That was as close as he came to praise. Then he pointed to the sky. "One freezing rain before snowpacks," he said. "Ice will coat every stem. The weight will triple. If your stakes are shallow, the wall will lie flat by morning." Ingrid looked at the unfinished east side. "How deep?" 10 inches, he said. "More on corners." Her first stakes were 8. She reset every corner before dark. The setbacks did not stop. Her axe handle split at the throat. Silas Rook sold replacements for 90 cents and smiled while naming the price. Ingrid traded her last coffee for one. Neil's cough turned to fever. She burned 2 precious days of wood, keeping the stove steady, and held him through a night when every breath sounded like cloth tearing. The slough froze hard enough to carry weight, then thawed, then froze again, leaving a crust that cut through her skirt hem and opened her shins. Silas closed the ridge trail and demanded a toll for hauling commercial reed. Lisa showed Ingrid an older path along the creek, longer by half a mile, and free because no one had thought to own it yet. Edda Nygaard, the nearest neighbor, came after days of saying she would not. She brought 2 boys, a sled, and a face arranged to show that help was not approval. "I still think this is foolish," Edda said. Ingrid handed her a willow strip. "Then make the foolish part tighter." They worked until lantern light made the reeds look black. By December 19th, the reed shell was finished. 117 stakes, 308 willow binders, 5 clay patches around the stove side. A 3-foot fire moat scraped down to bare frozen earth. A bent entry passage pointed away from the northwest wind. A drain gap under the lowest binder for spring melt. From the road, the cabin had almost disappeared. In its place stood a squat brown mound with a chimney pipe lifting smoke
and one dark slit where a person could crawl inside. It looked less like a house than an animal braced against weather. Silas rode past and called it a coffin again.
But this time, fewer men laughed. Because the first snow had begun to catch. It did not slide off the way snow slid off plain boards. It lodged in the cattail heads. It filled the slough grass. It sealed the small spaces between stems. Wind hit the shell, tore snow from the prairie, and threw that snow into the wall Ingrid had built for it. The storm was carrying bricks to its own barricade. The first proof came on a bitter night after Christmas. The thermometer Mikkel had loaned her hung near Niels's bed. Outside, the temperature fell below 0. Inside, after only 2 armloads of cottonwood, the needle held at 44 degrees. Cold, but not killing. The water bucket skinned with ice, but did not freeze solid. The boards behind the north wall stayed dry. Niels slept without coughing. Ingrid sat beside the stove until morning and watched the small flame work less than it had worked in November. That mattered. A poor person learns the difference between comfort and survival. Comfort is a warm floor. Survival is water you can still pour. Mikkel heard the number and refused to be impressed. Soft cold, he said. Wait for real wind. Lisa heard the number and asked one question. Dry boards? Yes. Then it is beginning. Not finished. Beginning. Because the true test came on January 9th. The day started wrong. Too warm. Snow dripped from the roof edge. The sky opened blue. Men left mittens at home and boys threw snowballs from bare hands. Ingrid did not trust it. She had known coastal storms that began with kindness. By noon, Lisa appeared at the door without knocking. She looked north. The horizon had gone pale. Not cloud, not fog. A white band low against the earth. Lisa took one breath and coughed hard into her sleeve. Water now, she said. Stove banked, door packed, boy inside. Ingrid did not ask why. She filled every pot. She fed the stove slow. She dragged a reed screen across the outer bend of the entry passage and packed snow at its base. Niels complained that the air was warm. Ingrid pulled him inside anyway. The temperature dropped 20 degrees before the clock hand reached 2. Then the wind struck. Not rising, not warning. Struck. One moment there was Prairie. The next, there was nothing but white force. Snow moved sideways so thick it erased the well, the sled, the stake tops, the slough, the world. The reed shell took the first blow with a deep, soft thump, like a fist into a mattress. Then another. Then a pressure so steady the cabin boards creaked inward. The candle flame leaned south and stayed there. Niels looked at it. Is the house moving? No, Ingrid said. She hoped the lie was small enough for God to forgive. For 3 hours the wall held. Then the northwest corner began to knock, not creak, knock.
Lisa heard it first. "Brace," she said. Ingrid put her ear to the boards. The corner support was loose.
One of the diagonal willow braces on the outside had broken free at the top and was striking the stake line with every surge. If it tore out, the wind would catch the west shield edge. If the west shield peeled away, the snow shell would break. If the shell broke, the cabin would be one board deep again. One board between Niels and the storm. Ingrid tied a rope around her waist. Lisa tied the other end to the door beam and pushed 3 warm willow loops into Ingrid's mitten. "Not rope," Lisa said. "Rope freezes stupid." Ingrid crawled into the entry passage. The wind found her halfway through and packed snow against her mouth. She turned her face into her shoulder, breathed through wool, and pushed forward. Outside, the world was not visible. It was texture, pressure, pain. She found the wall by touch. Stake, reed. Stake, reed. The rope pulled hard around her waist as the wind tried to take her sideways. The loose brace was at shoulder height, slamming in the dark white. She caught it with one hand, and the impact shot pain up her arm. The first willow loop fell from her mitten. Gone. The second slipped, then caught. She twisted it around brace and stake, pulled. The brace still moved. She reached higher, fingers bare now because one mitten had torn on frozen reed. Her skin stuck to ice. She ripped it free. The third loop went around the top, crossed under, and bit. The knocking stopped. For a second, she could not remember where the door was. There was no house, no yard, no ground, only wind and white. Then the rope at her waist jerked. Lisa, inside, pulling once, not to drag her, to give her direction. Ingrid followed the rope back with both hands and crawled into the entry passage on her knees. When she rolled into the cabin, her hair was white, her lips were blue, and blood was running from 3 fingers where the cold had taken skin. Niels was counting stove ticks. 209, he whispered. 210. Lisa took Ingrid's hand and put it near the stove, not too close. "Brace?" she asked. "Holding." Lisa nodded. "Then sit down before you fall down." The storm lasted 2 nights and most of a 3rd day. On the first night, Niels's fever returned. Smoke pressure pushed from the stove and made his cough bark from deep in his chest. Ingrid could not open the door. She could not open the draft too far without overfiring the pipe. Lisa hung a damp cloth near his face and made him breathe through it. On the 2nd day, snow found one seam near the floor and drew a white line across the dirt. Ingrid packed the crack with cloth and port grease. The line stopped. On the 2nd night, the outside cold dropped so low the stovepipe rang when the wind struck it. Inside, the thermometer near Niels's bed read 52. 52 degrees. Ingrid checked it twice. Then she checked the water bucket. Liquid. She touched the north boards. Dry.
She touched the west boards where the brace had been fixed. Dry. The reed shell had changed. It was no longer reeds.
The storm had forced snow into every stem gap, every cattail head, every rib, until the whole shield became a white, packed mass wrapped around a breathing channel of still air. The wall was not fighting winter. Winter had become part of the wall. Lisa watched the candle flame straighten. "There," she said. One word. Enough. Outside, the settlement was breaking. Mikael took shelter in a hay cut and lost skin from 2 fingers before he found a barn. Edda Nygaard's door froze shut on the second morning, and her sons chopped it open from inside with a stove poker. Silas Rook's hired man abandoned a team in the road and crawled toward a shape he could barely see in the white. Not a lamp, not a window, not smoke. A mound. A darker curve in the storm, where the reed shell had caught so much snow that it stood out against the flat white prairie. He followed it with one hand out and found Ingrid's entry passage. When he fell inside, his beard was frozen to his coat and his hands were the color of candle wax. Ingrid and Lisa fought him by inches. His name was Caleb Rook, Silas's nephew. He did not speak for nearly an hour. When he did, he looked toward the door and said, "I could see the shape of it when nothing else had shape." The wind died on the 3rd afternoon. The silence was so complete that Niels started crying. Not because he was afraid, because the world had stopped screaming and his body did not know what to do with peace. Ingrid opened the entry passage. The cabin was buried to the eaves on the north side. The reed wall had vanished under a curved shell of white. The west corner brace was frozen solid in place. The chimney pipe smoked from the top of the mound like a small black reed. The fire moat was clear. The clay collar had held. The door opened, and inside, the thermometer read 56. Men came over the next 2 days, because men come to measure whatever proves them wrong. Mikkel came with his fingers bandaged. He walked the perimeter slowly. He studied the snow ribs. He dug into one section with his knife until the cattails appeared under the packed snow. Then he came inside, stood near the stove, and looked at the water bucket. "I was wrong about the reeds," he said. He said it plainly. The way a man speaks after measuring a board and finding his first mark false. "But I was not wrong about winter," he added. "That is why this is worth writing down." He took out his Sawyer's notebook and made Ingrid repeat the numbers. 8 inches between stakes, 16 between ribs, a hand-width air channel, 10-inch corner stakes, willow binders twisted under, not over, cattail heads outward, earth clear around the pipe. At the top of the page he wrote a title, Madsen Snow Fence. Ingrid shook her head. "Not fence," she said. Mikkel crossed out fence. Then he wrote, Madsen Winter Shell. Edda came next. She did not apologize for laughing.
She looked at the entry passage, the elbow bend, the door that still opened after 2 days of horizontal snow. "My door became a wall," she said. "Yours stayed a door." Ingrid handed her a willow strip. "Then build the bend first." By the end of January, 4 families had built door passages. By February, 2 bachelor claims had wrapped their north walls. By March, Mikkel had a page of measurements from every attempt, including failures. Too much grass near the ground rotted, stakes too straight pulled under load, reeds tied with rope slipped, no air channel made boards wet, no clay collar made men nervous for good reason. Each correction mattered because a method that saves one cabin by luck is a story. A method that can be repeated is knowledge. Silas Rook did not come to learn, not at first. He began with accusation. He told the land clerk that Ingrid had been stripping marketable reed from the slough without right.
The clerk asked him when cattails had become marketable. Silas said anything that reduced cordwood purchases had value. Ingrid answered before the clerk could. "It had value after I worked it," she said, "not when you walked past it." That sentence traveled faster than Silas liked, so he changed tactics. He spoke of fire, reed near a stove, grass around a house, a widow's trick turning a cabin into tinder. Lisa heard the talk and snorted. "A man who sells fear will use whatever season is available," she said. But Ingrid did not dismiss the danger. She strengthened the answer. Removable panels for spring, wooden pins that could be knocked loose in April, a 6-inch drain gap under the lowest course so meltwater ran outward, extra clay at every stove wall. A bare earth break wide enough that ground fire had to stop before it reached the shell. Lisa made her write those rules first. "Never teach warmth without teaching fire," she said. In the autumn of 1888, the school board asked Mikko whether the winter shell could work around the schoolhouse. The school sat on open prairie, 1 room, plank walls, a stove that ate wood faster than the board could buy it. Children sat with numb fingers and wrote on slates through mittens. Mikko brought his notebook to the meeting. He brought Edda, who had built the first door bend after Ingrid's. He brought Caleb Rook, who had survived by seeing the shape of a wall in a whiteout. He did not bring Ingrid. No one had invited her. She went anyway. The men were already lashing reed to the north wall with rope. Ingrid stood behind them until she could no longer bear it. "Rope pulls straight," she said. A man with a red beard turned around. "Beg pardon?" "Rope pulls straight. Snow pulls down. Wind pulls sideways. Rope answers 1 question, and winter asks 3. He looked at Mikkel. Mikkel opened his notebook. "She is right," he said. "I wrote it down." The rope came off. Willow went on. The schoolhouse took 3 days to wrap. North wall, west wall, bent entry, clay collar, bare earth moat, removable pins. That winter the school burned nearly half the wood it had burned the year before. The children on the far bench stopped writing with gloves on. That was the moment the wall stopped being Ingrid's oddity and became the settlement's arithmetic. Silas could resist pride. He could resist numbers longer than most men. but he could not resist a child. In February of 1889, another ground blizzard swept through the crossing. Shorter than the Great Storm, still blind enough to erase a road in minutes. Silas's 9-year-old niece, Alma, had gone from the store to the stable for a bridle. 40 yards, that was all. The white closed while she was inside. When she stepped out, the store was gone. The stable vanished behind her. She walked because children know standing still is bad, even when they do not know where movement leads. She found a shape, a low white mound behind the schoolhouse where the wrapped woodshed stood. The snow shell made shadow in a world without edges. Alma crawled behind it and found the wind shadow on the lee side where the reeds broke the ground drift and the packed snow held still. Searchers found her 20 minutes later, pressed against the wall with both hands inside her coat. They carried her to Ingrid's cabin because everyone knew it was the warmest room near the crossing. Silas arrived with his hat frozen white and his voice missing. He saw Alma by the stove, fingers pink, eyes open. He saw the thermometer at 51 degrees. He saw Ingrid kneeling beside the child he loved. For once, he did not calculate quickly enough to hide what he felt. He did not apologize. Men like Silas often treat apology as if it costs more than debt. But he looked at the reed wall, then at Ingrid. "Say the spacing again," he said. Ingrid was quiet for a long moment. There were many answers she had imagined giving him. Sharp ones, heavy ones. Answers that would make him carry his own laughter back through the snow. But Lisa's voice sat in the room. "Do not make them bow. Make them remember." So Ingrid gave him the numbers. 8 inches between stakes, 16 between ribs, hand width breathing channel, 10-inch corners, willow, not rope, clay at pipe, earth clear below, reed heads outward. Silas repeated each one. 2 weeks later, 2 wagon loads of willow poles appeared behind the schoolhouse. No note, no speech, just sorted poles cut to length. In that settlement, it was the closest Silas Rook ever came to saying he had been wrong. Lisa Corpy died the next spring, not from winter, from lungs that had been damaged long before Ingrid met her. She died in the peat dugout beyond the slough, with the first thaw dripping from the roof and Niels counting the drops because counting had once helped him survive fear. Before she died, she gave Ingrid a narrow knife worn thin from splitting willow. The handle smelled of smoke and wet grass. "Hands forget less when tools remind them," Lisa said. Ingrid kept the knife on the shelf beside the stove. Every autumn after that, she used it to split the first willow of the season. By 1892, 20 cabins around the Knife River crossing used some version of the winter shell. Some wrapped the whole cabin, some only the north wall. Some built nothing but a bent door passage because even one door that opened after a blizzard could save a life. Barns got half shields, calf sheds got wind ribs. The schoolhouse put its panels up every October and took them down every April. Mikkel kept the measurement book until his eyes failed. Edda taught door bends to new families before Ingrid arrived. Caleb Rook, who had crawled through Ingrid's entry half frozen, became the best chimney collar man in the settlement. Silas continued selling wood, but he could no longer sell the lie that wood was the only answer. That was the true damage Ingrid had done to him. Not insult, not revenge. An alternative. Niels grew tall in rooms that stayed warm enough for his cough to leave him. He learned his arithmetic on a slate inside the wrapped schoolhouse. Each November, when he was old enough to stand on a bench, he wrote the spacing rules on the school wall in chalk. 8 inches. 16 inches. Hand width air. Willow, not rope. Clay and earth before fire. Reed heads to the wind. Children copied them the way they copied sums. Some remembered the numbers. Some remembered only the smell of cattails and snow. But enough remembered. Years later, after Ingrid built a real house with glass windows and a roof that did not flap in hard wind, she still walked the old cabin line every November. The first shanty was gone. The stakes had rotted into the ground, but snow gathered there before it gathered anywhere else, because the old reed line had changed the grass, changed the drift, changed the way wind crossed that little piece of prairie. Niels, grown and teaching by then, told her she did it from habit. Ingrid looked at the white beginning to collect along the vanished wall. "Winter respects habit," she said. When Silas Rook first saw her work, he called it a coffin. When the children mocked it, they called it a muskrat house. When the blizzard came, the thing they mocked became the only shape visible in a world with no horizon. The reeds everyone ignored caught the snow. The snow everyone feared became the shield. The wind that came to strip heat from her walls was forced to build the wall higher. Ingrid Madsen did not make the prairie merciful. She made it take the long way to her door.